morning from across Europe, and that's always good. Before we begin, as always, we just want to make sure that everybody is on site. If there are any technical issues, there will be an opportunity to type into the chat and maybe get some support that way. But before we begin, a quick technical check just to make sure that everybody can at least hear us. And what I'd like you to do is to raise your hand if you can hear. And to help you with that, of course, I'll show you. So on the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you should see a small hand. If you click on that hand, you will see this menu, this colorful menu, where you have the option to raise your hand. If you could all raise your hand to confirm that you can hear the webinar, that will be a good indication for us that we're not just talking to ourselves. So guys, go down to the very bottom. In the gray chat box, there will be a hand at the very bottom right corner, unless you've moved the chat box, but look for the chat box and click on the hand. Once you have the hand, you should have the option to click the blue button, which is raise your hand. Let's hopefully see if we're getting lots of good mornings. No hand, but sound is good. Okay. So interesting that we don't see the hand, but at least, yes, if no sound. Guys, you should probably have a little pod that's going to give you some indication of a video screen and sound and microphone. But our technical guys will give you a hand in the chat box. Fingers crossed. How many hands are we getting? We're getting a very small number of hands. People are still familiarizing themselves with the layout. Remember, you'll have the main screen, and then you should have a small AV pod, and there will be little buttons with camera and microphone. If they are in red, you need to click on those to make them green. That will certainly make sure that you get... we're getting more hands now. Somebody's saying turn it down. Maybe you have to turn your own volume down, guys, because apparently the rest are quite happy with this. Maybe people are still grabbing a cup of coffee. Somebody has got a down thumb, which means it's not working. Same here, no hand, but sound is good. Okay, listen, any indication, at least we know now that you can see the chat box. So I'll just talk you very quickly through the webinar tools. So as I say, you should be able to see a list of attendees where we are identified either as speakers or as other participants. There was an emoji icon, it's now a hand icon, but in some cases you might see an emoji. Click on the icon and it should give you these additional functions where you can agree or disagree, where we need to speak louder or softer, etc. We have done a lot of testing on the volume levels. We think they're okay, but you will have your own volume controls on your PC if you find they're a little bit loud. There's also the chat box. We want you to use that chat box if you have questions, and we'll try and make a record of those. We're not going to be able to address them immediately, but we'll try and keep a track of those, and at key points we'll try and address the key questions. And if there are outstanding questions at the end, we'll just make a note and find a way to communicate those to you at the end. So it's good to know that at least, I would say, now we're getting a good 50% show of hands. The rest are perhaps still waking up in the morning. So guys, hopefully you found either the chat box or the symbols to communicate with us, but lots of people are saying good morning, hi, sound is good. One or two people with no sound. Hopefully our technical team can work with you to address that. So guys, as I've said, this is the ECVET for beginners. It really is the basics. Some of you will be using this as a refresher. Others will be totally new to the whole concept of ECVET or ECVET. And we will use those terms interchangeably across the morning. So there will be sometimes in the same sentence, I might say ECVET or ECVET. It's fine. Just find whatever you're comfortable with. I don't think there's been a European consensus on how to say this word. What you should know, of course, is that I'm not the only one here this morning, so it's important to meet the team. My name's Paul. I'm from Scotland. I've spent the last 30 years in and around education and training, and have a real penchant for learning and skills recognition and vocational education and training, and those are very much at the heart of what we're talking about this morning. I'd like to invite the second presenter to say hello and introduce herself, Monica.
Hi, good morning, everyone. This is Monica. I am based in Vienna, Austria, and I've been a member of the ECVET Secretariat actually for a couple of years now and have worked on these topics and issues for quite a number of years. So welcome, everyone.
Thank you, Monica. And as I say, we'll be taking the presenter's role this morning and dividing across the different sections. So as with all things ECVET, where we talk about learning targets or learning goals, it would be wrong of us not to have our own goals this morning. And our goal for this morning is really about knowledge sharing. And it's going to be predominantly one way with an option for questions. But we really want you to leave by the end of this session knowing what ECVET is, knowing the history, the goals, the rationale, what it really aims to deliver, how ECVET works, what are the core principles and components, and how it's used, and who is working in and around ECVET. And by that, we're talking about the different countries, how they interact and make use of ECVET, but also the different actors, and how you might follow that up as well in terms of for additional support. So those are the goals for today. Just as a little introduction, I often think when we start talking about European tools and instruments and learning recognition, people, oh my, that's something extra, something additional. It's more bureaucracy. It's going to be complex. And that's the kind of ABC model. Whereas I personally support the DEF model. And I think that what we're here to do today is to demystify ECVET and to explain those key terms and make them easier to use. And we're going to facilitate the use of ECVET for those of you that are perhaps new to this for the very first time. So it's the DEF model that we're going for today. And that I would like to hand over to question time. Whoops. Now, we know that some of you have had a little bit of difficulty in interacting. Hopefully this won't be too difficult. It's an easy question. I want you to address the first question. Very simple one, guys. Have you had your coffee this morning? There are three options. Yes, thanks, I've had it. No, no, I'm a tea drinker, or no, nothing but water for me. So we need you to tick on this. This is our practice run question in a sense to see whether the technologies are working, whether people are having difficulties. So we just wait a brief moment whilst everybody's clicking on this, and then we should be able to see the results coming up on screen from our technical support team here. We'll be able to work out how many have had their coffee. Well, very good, actually. 62% of you have had your coffee, 12% going for tea, and then the salvation, the healthy amongst us, on a water diet early in the day. Still a couple of people not managing to interact. Hopefully then, if there are any technical issues or the question was too difficult, I'm not sure, they need to drink more coffee. So we're going to go back now to the main session where we have a real question for you. And of course, the have you had your coffee question was a bit of fun, but now we're going to go to question two. And in question two, we want you to think, what do the letters ECVET, ECVET, or ECVET represent? And you're going to be given three options on your screen. And so we'll wait for those to come up. And again, we'd like you to vote on here as soon as those come up. So there you have the three options. Is it European Community System for Vocational Education and Training? Is it the Educational Credit System for Vocational Education and Training? Or is it the European Credit System for Education and Training? So have a little go. I know it's early in the morning. Those who've had their coffee, you'll be fine. You're raring to go. Tea probably brings the same. Water drinkers, let's see if you're firing the neurons this morning. And again, just giving a little bit of time for everybody to go through and put their choice in. So we should see the results coming up any moment now, once people have voted. Let's see where you are. Okay, That's as to be expected. So you'll see the majority have gone for the European credit system, vocational education and training, which is really what it is. But the other two, to be fair, are a little play on words because they're all not so far away from the realities. Hopefully, had we asked this question at the end, especially for those that are new, it would become fairly clear in terms of what ECVET represents and stands for. So that's very good, a useful indicator of where we are in terms of understanding. Let's go back to the main slides now. And I would like to invite Monica to take over at this point.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So it's nice to see that most of you selected the correct answer in the poll already anyway, but what does it actually mean and imply when we say that ECVET is the European credit system for vocational education and training? In very formal words, we say that ECVET is a framework for the transfer, recognition, and accumulation of acquired and assessed learning outcomes with a view to achieving a qualification. In other words, ECVET is an instrument designed to address the following challenges in VET. So getting recognition for learning outcomes already achieved by a learner, either at home or abroad in another country, achieving more flexibility in the design of qualifications and educational programs, and improving the transparency of qualifications. So making them more easily understood by learners and employers at home and abroad. At the core of ECVET stands the idea of providing a set of principles and tools that can be flexibly applied across countries and different systems of education and training. So the goal is to give learners the possibility to transfer their learning to other contexts, to build their own flexible pathways to a qualification, both in the context of lifelong learning, but also in the context of geographical mobility. And that's also what this little sailboat is trying to show us, these two broad strands of application of ECVET. So ECVET is characterized by a couple of key concepts that build its core. And one of them is the focus on the use of learning outcomes. Learning outcomes, and I'm sure you've heard the term, they are understood as statements of what a learner knows, understands, and is able to do on completion of a learning process. So moving to a learning outcomes-oriented approach means the focus is shifted from learning inputs, such as, for instance, the place of learning, the duration of a learning experience, the learner's age, or any access requirements, to achievements of outcomes of learners. And the second important concept in the context of ECVET is the concept of units or units of learning outcomes. A unit of learning outcomes is a component of a qualification, and it consists of a coherent set of knowledge, skills, and competencies that is able to be assessed and validated separately. You might hear some countries rather use the term module in the system, and they basically mean the same, although in very technical terms, actually, there would be a difference between what is a unit and a module. But it's also actually language issues that might play a role here. So what we see here in this nice blue figure, it basically shows us how qualifications are described according to ECVET principles. A qualification, let's say a diploma in IT network systems administration, consists of several units that can all be assessed and validated separately. If we stick to the IT example, one unit could be called configuring networking devices, another one could be called user support and consultancy in IT. Each of these units is then described through a set of different learning outcomes statements. And this is actually what we then call the structured description of qualifications in ECVET. There's also a couple of other concepts that are very much used in ECVET. ECVET distinguishes between the terms credit and credit points. So in ECVET language, as a way, ECVET points and credit are two different things. Credit points, or also called ECVET points, they are a numerical representation of the overall weight of learning outcomes and also the relative weight of units in relation to a qualification. It's important to note that ECVET points are not mandatory in the use of ECVET, so you can use ECVET with or without points. They are one element of the structured description of qualification, so in addition to the description in terms of units of learning outcomes, and they can be used whenever they add value in a specific vocational education and training concept. One important concept, as I said, in ECVET is the concept of credit, which is slightly different from credit points. By credit, we mean a set of learning outcomes that an individual has achieved and which can be assessed and recognized. They can ideally be accumulated towards a qualification or transferred to other learning programs, other courses, or other qualifications, or across countries. So let's briefly get back to the beginnings, in a way, of ECVET. ECVET was developed by EU member states in cooperation with the European Commission and adopted by the European Parliament and Council back in 2009, so pretty much 10 years ago. After a testing phase of a couple of years with many pilot projects and testing projects, countries have started to implement ECVET. The adoption and implementation of ECVET in the participating countries, is voluntary, so that's important to note. And we observe across countries that while some countries have decided to implement ECVET principles fully across the entire vocational education and training system, others may opt to only implement part of these principles. And some countries or groups of countries may even only use it in the context of transnational mobility in VET, so for sending learners abroad and hosting learners from other countries. So this arguably very daunting figure just wants to highlight the goals and technical components of ECVET. So it pretty much summarizes what I've told you just now. Remember that ECVET can be basically used for two different applications. So the one would be the transnational mobility for all. So when learners go abroad and do some kind of a learning period in another country. And the second application would be in the context of lifelong learning. In a way, ECVET wants to make everybody's lives easier when getting recognition for learning outcomes already achieved, either at home or abroad. And also in achieving more flexibility in the design of qualifications and educational programs. And as a result, improving the transparency of qualifications. So in a way, making them more easily understood by both learners and employers and in other contexts and countries. In this right column, with these many items, you can find the so-called ECVET technical components that support its implementation across countries. We have already discussed actually the first three, which relate to the structured description of qualifications. So they are summarized as transparency of qualifications in this chart. The other ECVET technical components refer to the process of accumulating and transferring learning outcomes either across programs or across countries. But you'll hear more about them a little bit later. So, with quite a lot of technical detail from my part and a lot of technical talk on ECVET, this might actually be a good opportunity now to see whether any questions have emerged in the chat. Paul, do we have any questions from the group?
Yes, Monica, it's been fairly busy. The outset was all around technical, different browsers. What's the difference between a hand and an emoji? Good, we're still learning. We're just learning technology as well this morning. We have 40 participants from across Europe. We even have someone in the Channel Tunnel, it seems. So we've got lots going on, and we are definitely reading all of the comments that are coming in, guys. So please make use of the chat box and put your questions in there. We have I thought it was a particularly useful input, Monica, on points versus credit. It's important and it's always confusing, so thanks for pointing that out. We have a couple of questions. One is, I think, leads naturally into the next section, so I'm going to plant both of these. Are learning outcomes different to learning objectives? And I think that's really a good lead into where we're going next with the presentation. So I think I'll leave you with that one. There's another one coming, but there's an acronym used that I'm not familiar with, so I think I would ask them to clarify that acronym. Thank you. But I'll just let you take on the next one, and we can address any outstanding questions at the next stopping point. Back to you, Monica.
Okay, thanks, Paul. So it's great that learning outcomes have popped up actually so prominently in the chat, because that's exactly what we wanted to talk about right now. So let's continue to explore a little bit more the concept of units of learning outcomes and learning outcomes. So units of learning outcomes might be delivered either as part of one or more qualifications, or defined specifically for a period of geographic transnational mobility, and which comprise a coherent set of knowledge, skills, and competencies. We've prepared some useful pointers for you when writing your own learning outcome statements. So in order for learning outcomes to be understood by others, you should use active verbs to describe what the learner will be able to do and demonstrate. So this implies using words like describe, perform, explain. When formulating or writing learning outcomes, they should be achievable as a result of a learning activity. One should use a language that learners can understand, and so employers or other people dealing with these learning outcomes should be able to understand the language used. This also implies avoid using verbs where the meaning is ambiguous. So terms or verbs like understand, listen, learn, know are actually too vague and too ambiguous to make a learning outcome statement that is formulated in an achievable and unambiguous way. Also, learning outcome statements should be able to be observed, measured, and assessed. And here a note that might be interesting to keep in mind. It's important to note that not all learning can actually be defined in learning outcomes. So learning outcomes are a good way of describing learning, but you should not assume or expect that learning outcomes are able to capture each and every learning that takes place. So, getting a little bit more into detail of the writing of learning outcomes. So, when you write your learning outcomes, it makes sense to focus on the learner and start with an action verb, as I just briefly presented, and then continue with some sort of object of the verb and complete it with an indication of the context, which is quite important for learning outcome statements to be observable and to be capable of assessment. This context information can either be related to learning or to work. This fully depends on the context. And you can see two examples of learning outcome statements that we've prepared for you. So if you pick the second one, for instance, one very typical learning outcome statement could be: the learner will be able to demonstrate an understanding of the personal nutrition requirements of different customer groups. So this is obviously from some kind of healthcare diploma. Whether you use future tense or present tense, or whether you use plural and say the learners are able to, or the learners are capable of, this does not really play an important role. So this is really up to you and your preferences. We've had in the chat the question about the difference between learning outcomes and learning achievements. There is a difference actually, although maybe when you read a learning outcome statements, you might not always be able to distinguish whether this is a learning achievement or learning outcome. The difference behind is actually the intention. So when you formulate learning aims or learning objectives, this is usually a specific statement of teaching intention. So it indicates one of the specific areas that a teacher intends to cover in a block of learning. So it's pretty much the perspective that changes. So learning objectives are pretty much formulated from rather a teacher's perspective or viewpoint, whereas learning outcomes really focus on the outcomes achieved by a particular learner. So we have another summarizing figure here, actually. So you've briefly heard me mention the concept of transfer and accumulation of learning outcomes earlier on when we had this huge figure. This means creating and implementing arrangements to allow learning outcomes to be achieved and assessed in one setting, and afterwards transferred to another setting where they are validated and recognized. So allowing acquired learning outcomes to be accumulated, of course, in accordance with national rules and VET laws, with a view to achieving a full qualifications. And the figure below that you see hopefully on your screens, it just summarizes these key elements of ECVET. So with the structured description of qualifications through units of learning outcomes and complementarily the ECVET points, and also the set transfer process for units of learning outcomes. And to support this process, ECVET provides a number of documents and templates and predefined steps to support people in implementing and applying ECVET. So again, after quite a lot of technical talk, and before I hand you over to Paul again, I have actually prepared another little poll for you. So you should see a question popping up on your screen, and please select your option. It just give you a couple of moments to pick your preferred option, and then we see the outcome of this little poll. So we should see a result quite soon. Yes, there it is. So we have a mixed feedback, I would say. So close to half of the group was already aware of learning outcomes, but I see there's also still a couple of people who are eager to know more about learning outcomes and all these concepts. And I admit that the concept of learning outcomes in units is probably one of the key concepts behind ECVET, and not one that is easily understood and not at all easily implemented, actually. So with this, I hand you over to Paul, who is going to tell you a little bit more about it.
Yes, thanks, Monica. We've had a couple of questions, and it's nice to see there's some interaction in the chat box as well, and that's good. And really where you've planted the seed there for the sort of the structural elements of ECVET and how that might be used in designing and developing qualifications, accumulating learning and transferring learning and so on. And that's very good. And now I want to move on to a slightly different angle. And thinking about where it's used. And I think often we go over, that's all very good, but how does that affect me? That doesn't relate to what I do. And I think we've often stepped back, and in 2015, this was an opportunity to do the same, and stepped back and said, okay, what's actually happening in the different European countries? So in 2015, and monitoring the use of ECVET in different European countries, there was work done to see what level of use and implementation of ECVET was taking place in the different countries. And there were categorization, I suppose, into three areas. So there was a group one, which was they had a great starting point in terms of their credit systems were very compatible with ECVET and the things that we described, units and learning outcomes and so on. There was group 2 that were perhaps working towards having a compatible system or something that was compatible with ECVET, or that were testing one or more different elements or components of ECVET, and that could be for mobility or for qualifications development, and they were the group 2 countries. And there were a group of countries that were perhaps further distanced from ECVET, and that is to say that they perhaps didn't have any direct evidence of ECVET being relevant or compatible with their existing vocational education and training systems or initiatives. And those were the 3 groups. And it is, here we have that sort of breakdown into those groups 1, 2, and 3, and the subdivision in group 2 as well. This comes from the ECVET in Europe monitoring report from CEDEFOP in 2015, and it has been updated more recently from a European Commission funded study in 2019, where there was a look at different tools and instruments for recognition in VET. It is important, however, to say that even if countries are in group 3, so for example, where systems are perhaps not wholly compatible with the whole ECVET mantra, there are certainly pockets of practice, even in those countries, where people are looking at, well, actually, some of the concepts of ECVET are wholly relevant to what we do in our mobility programs, for example. And so there you might see institutional delivery or groups of organizations working together under the heading of ECVET or its principles, and that's quite important to recognize. So even those appearing in group 3, there's definitely evidence of practice, and so it's interesting to show where the different countries appear there. We've talked a lot about systems level, and I think now it's important to think about how does ECVET complement mobility, geographical mobility, transnational mobility, etc. is a core part of Erasmus Plus and other program delivery, and what we try to do is to facilitate that for vocational education and training learners and staff to go to different countries and to undertake part of their learning. And what ECVET provides there is, in a sense, a mechanism for accumulating, validating, recognizing learning. And we've given you this example here, which shows 2 different qualifications, so a Dutch qualification and a Spanish VET qualification. And what we're trying to show, I suppose, is that you can undertake a part of your program of learning or qualification in one country and transfer and import, in a sense, that learning into another country's qualification system. And this is really the underlying concept of using ECVET in a mobility perspective, where we really want to say that if somebody is taking time out to go to another country to undertake learning acquisition, what we really want to do is to be able to say that that learning has value, it is important, and it can be brought back, and having followed all of the required practices and processes, it can be recognized in some form. And in some cases that might be extra credit, in some cases equally that might form a composite part of an existing qualification. And to facilitate that delivery, we have a number of tools and instruments as well. So we have a memorandum of understanding, a learning agreement, and a personal transcript. And what I'd like to do now is to take you step by step through the core elements of ECVET and how it might support geographical mobility in vocational education and training, or VET. We really do divide this down into 3 key steps, and those of you who may have visited the ECVET toolkit in the past will see that it's based on a similar concept of before mobility, during mobility, and after mobility. And I'm really just going to walk you through those different stages. So starting with, of course, before mobility. And often, and this would be no surprise that before mobility, the planning and preparation stage has a significant number of elements to it, and good preparation, of course, will lead to successful implementation normally. So before mobility, the key steps here are about establishing or confirming a partnership, having the right people in the right places in both countries so that you can facilitate this mobility, preparing a memorandum of understanding, which we'll come to shortly, identifying units of learning outcomes. We talked earlier about how a qualification might often comprise units or modules, and within that there will be learning outcomes, which Monica has already described. The early stage discussions on assessment need to take place beforehand. It's no point having somebody go all the way to another country and then saying, how are we going to assess this? So really those discussions need to take place fairly early on. Equally, there's an important discussion that needs to take place in terms of how do we document achievement? Is there an evidence process, or are there documents and forms that need to be completed with a view to satisfying the needs of my own institution in my own country? Because only at that point, if you meet the quality assurance expectations of your own institution and country, can you then go down the formal avenue of securing validation and formal recognition. And of course, for the learner, it's important that they are fully aware of all of the key steps. And there we look at having a learning agreement that is really down to itemizing all of the key aspects for the learner themselves. So we're going to look very quickly at some of these terms that we've already mentioned a couple of times. So the Memorandum of Understanding, or the MOU, or the MAO, or whatever it is that you call it, this is an institutional level agreement, and it's an agreement which formalizes the relationship between the different partners, often done at a very high level. And what we're talking about here, you have to confirm the qualifications, the sectors, the disciplines, fields, programs, etc., that are being targeted with which mobility is incorporated. So in a sense, if you have a mobility program for hairdressing or engineering, etc., it's important to clarify immediately what those are and what the levels are as well. And here we might be talking about national and or European qualifications frameworks as a tool to enable this comparison and translation, because a level 5 in one country may be a level 6 in another. And so really using the EQF, which we will come back to later, as a tool for comparison. Listing the learning outcomes. It's no point just talking at this upper level. It's going to be part of this qualification. It really is important to come down to, where do we feel the learning outcomes will be? And again, the learning agreement for the individual may well be the point where we get down to the real sort of detail. But if you already know that there are specific learning outcomes that are going to form part of a program, you can already have those listed there. Detailing the assessment, validation, and recognition processes, but also the roles of the different actors and who will do what. And finally, agreeing to a certain level of quality assurance. And there may well be institutional requirements that everybody has to agree to tick certain boxes for quality assurance. And that's quite important that you incorporate that into your memorandum of understanding, your partnership agreement. They're all the same thing, lots of different terms, but the ECVET term for this is a memorandum of understanding. Now, we also talked about the learning agreement, and the learning agreement it's an individual document, so we're no longer talking about an agreement between 2 or 3 institutions for program level delivery of mobility. We're talking about a single agreement for a single learner that is signed up to by all of the different actors. It provides information on the mobility period. When will it take place, from where to where, etc. What is the duration? It confirms specific learning outcomes that the learner is expected to achieve. And this is very important, that the learner themselves, they own that they identify that this is their target, this is their goal, and they know what this is in terms of the value that it will have in terms of the ultimate qualificational program. There are assessment mechanisms already talked about at institutional level, but again, in the learning agreement, it's important that the learner identifies and recognizes what those assessment mechanisms will be, the tools, the approaches, the timing, and if any documentation is required to support that, what that is and who is responsible for holding that. The roles of the different partners and responsibilities, but also of the learner, who will assess when and where, etc. All of this is detailed in the learning agreement. It's something that everybody is party to. And ultimately, if there's a form of evidence that might be required in terms of somebody signing off certain documentation or having to have multiple signatures, this needs to be clear at this stage so that everybody understands what this learner needs to be able to get the value out of their learning mobility program. And this is all at the planning stage. Remember, we're still in before mobility. So all of those key steps have to take place: the planning, the documentation, the signing of agreements, before anybody goes anywhere. No trips to the airports or the train station or whatever. And then only when everything is clear and everybody knows what their roles will be during mobility can we really think about the delivery. And in during mobility, it's really fairly simple. We're talking about providing the learning activities that have been agreed, those activities that will allow the learning outcomes to be achieved, and so on. is a process of assessment that has already been agreed upon that will be delivered. And there's a process of documenting the results of that assessment. And that could be, for example, in a personal transcripts, which is a document which describes the learning outcomes that have been achieved as opposed to those which are being targeted. When we're thinking about assessing learning outcomes, it is very important. Again, we've talked about this. I'm just really underlining this, that partners need to agree who will assess the identified learning outcomes, what mechanisms will be used, and also to think practically about the different learning environments. Because if you're a large organization that has certain technical equipment, it may well be that your requirement is that there needs to be an observation in using a particular machine or in doing a particular process. When we translate that to another country, another learning environment, another workplace or vet institution, it may well be very different equipment. So it is quite important to think about the practicality, the feasibility, the achievability of different assessment mechanisms and goals, and whether that can be done off-site, so to speak. For the sending organizations as well, it is important for you to think about, well, okay, our organization is quite particular. We have a certain demand, and if we don't meet this documentary demand, we won't be able to award our future qualification because our awarding body or national authority will not allow that. So if you have particular demands for documentation or evidence and so on, you need to have that signed off during the mobility. It's often much easier to do this during than to think about this afterwards. Recording assessment results, we've talked already about this personal transcript. Quite often it's down to the individual learner to keep a record of what they've done. Sometimes this gets signed off, sometimes not. And there is one very well-known tool. There are lots of versions of this out there, but one very well-known tool is Europass Mobility. I've provided a link here. And you know, it's a part of a series of tools, and Monica will come back on this a little bit later. But you know, think about getting mobility, Europass Mobility, downloading it, having a look at this, seeing how suitable that is for your needs in terms of documenting the results of an assessment in another country. And also think about whether there is additional evidence needs. We've talked about that might be assessment grids, written assessment portfolios, signed witness testimonies, etc. So you've got your planning, you put in place all of these documents. These are a core part of ECVET. These allow you to have a quality assured mobility. You deliver that, but it doesn't really stop there. You really do then have to think, okay, what happens afterwards? And so we're talking about, we've had the mobility delivered, we've had assessment taking place, there's documentation that's coming back. How do we then validate that the required processes have been followed, that the required documents are in place, that these are sufficient to meet the demands of our own institution, to then allow for these learning outcomes to be formally validated, verified, and recognized? And there are different terms used in different countries, which really giving value to that learning. Think about those bricks that were coming back from the Dutch qualification to the Spanish one. What needs to happen to allow that to happen? So that's the one thing. It's really about giving value to that learning. The second thing that is very important is that we provide an opportunity at the end of a whole mobility program to evaluate the processes and results and see what worked and what didn't and what could be improved. And this is a core part of European sort of ECVET systems, but also of broader systems for quality assurance in vet, that you take an opportunity to look at what worked and what didn't. Now, we talked about two terms here that you may be looking at me going, this is quite strange. I'm not familiar with these terms, or that doesn't seem to work in my case. And we, at European level at least, we're using these terms validation and recognition. When you translate that down to your own systems and in your own languages, it may mean something slightly different, or you may use a slightly different term. And this is accepted and it is normal. But here we wanted to provide clarification on what we meant at European level for you to have a good starting point. And by validation, it's a process by which the sending institution, so you that are sending staff and learners out, can confirm that the assessment that has been undertaken meets your own needs and expectations. We talked about planning and delivery, and this is the end stop there. You're going after mobility. Has this been successfully documented and assessed? And we have all of the required documentation. And once that has been done, and you can confirm that everything that was planned was done to the required level, you can initiate a process that allows, hopefully, the inclusion of the assessed learning outcomes to become part of or in addition to an existing program or qualification. We have accepted that not in all cases will this become a composite part of a qualification, because it's not in all cases, consistent with national delivery. However, if it's not part of a qualification, it's something, could be something or should be something that is recognition as extra credit or in addition to an existing qualification, and that is very important. So those are the three core elements of what I call about using ECVET and its tools to quality assure mobility. Now, Monica, I've paid no attention at all to the chat box. Where are we? Have we got any questions?
Oh, we do have one question, actually, Paul, for which you might be the perfect expert, actually. So we have one question in the chat that says, are there any examples of memoranda of understanding, learning agreements, or personal transcripts that are available for people to take a look at? So as an example and inspiration, I suppose.
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I think it's a question that has been repeated many, many times, because there's nothing worse than starting with an empty page. And then, of course, you can go off in a direction that it doesn't really help. We have two things that are important to remember here. The templates themselves are an excellent starting point. They've been agreed at European level by those working to help to develop ECVET as a concept, as a tool, as a process. And they are there as your starting point. So it really tells you the kind of document that you're going to create. It tells you the composite parts of that document, and it really, name, address, type of organization, that's all written for you. But that's only a good starting point for the template, and you can add to that by any means if you have national requirements. What I think is very useful as well is the ECVET toolkit, and there we've brought together real examples developed by projects and others who have been very kind, and they've shared what they've developed for themselves, and they said that's absolutely fine, share that with the wider community. And that gives you an example of how the questions have been answered. So you have a template with the questions, which is a good starting point for those starting afresh, but we also have examples of how that might be completed, and there you can see how different people have understood how to document learning outcomes in a learning agreement, or how a memorandum of understanding might be pulled together, and of course a personal transcript, how that might be completed by learners and others. So definitely the ECVET toolkit. We're going to pull the address up at the end, and it will be in the slides that you ultimately receive. So that's a very good question. Thanks, Monica.
Okay, so I think for the moment that's all that we have in terms of question, but I do think if there's still any question that might pop up, we might have a couple of seconds towards the end to address them. So for now, maybe let's continue with the presentation, and I now plan to go a bit actually to the meta level of things, if you want. So as you probably know, ECVET is not a standalone thing. So ECVET is one of a number of different European tools or instruments in the field of education and training. You might have come across some of them. ECVET is somehow related to all of them. You see a couple of logos and acronyms on this slide. These are the main ones. These are not all initiatives that are related to ECVET in a certain way. What links them all to each other is that they have a common goal to improve the quality, transparency, and permeability of education and training systems. Some of these are purely related to vocational education and training, while others are more global and address the education and training systems on the whole, without without making reference to a separate subsystem of education and training. At this stage, we would really be curious actually to know which of these tools, instruments, frameworks, and initiatives you know. So as before, you should soon see a little poll appear on your screen where you'll be asked to select those instruments that you already know. So we have the European Qualification Framework, EQF, the European Quality Assurance in Vocational Education and Training, ECVET. We have Europass, Paul has mentioned it already. There is ESCO, the European Skills, Competences, Qualifications and Occupations Classification, the European Mobility Scoreboard, validation of non-formal and informal learning with an acronym that you simply cannot pronounce, and the Upskilling Pathways Initiative. So please choose any of these initiatives that you know. Of course, you can pick multiple options. and we are quite curious to see how many of these instruments are actually known or familiar to the group. Just take a couple of moments until you read through all the terms and acronyms. So let's wait for a couple of moments to see whether we get a clear winner. Oh, we do. Oh, we see that Europass is very well known. Yeah, that's not surprising, but we also see quite a high score actually for ECVET and for EQF. I would have expected this for EQF, but not so much for ECVET, to be very honest with you. There's a relatively low score for the European Mobility Scoreboard, and yeah, a moderate one for validation and the Upskilling Pathways Initiative. So since we are a little bit short of time, I will not have the time actually to go into detail about all of these initiatives or instruments, but I will say a couple of words about the most important of them, or not, maybe not the most important, but those maybe that share the closest links in a way with ECVET. The one that ranked quite highly just early on in the poll is the European Qualifications Framework, EQF. The EQF acts as a translation device to allow qualifications and levels of qualifications to be compared across countries and systems. One important point here is that it shares with ECVET the concept of learning outcomes, which is actually at the heart of both of these instruments. Then just a couple of brief words, because it popped up so prominently in the poll just early on, about ECVET. ECVET is the European Quality Assurance in VET initiative. So even if it ranked up quite highly in the poll, I guess that the acronym to at least some of you might not sound that familiar. But you might recognize ECVET from its four-stage quality circle, which is at the core of ECVET, and which actively promotes the use of quality management tools in vocational education and training. There's another instrument that actually ranked quite highly in the poll, which is Europass. I'm sure that most of you know the Europass CV template. Europass actually consists of several different elements and templates, and it is also currently in the process of being revised at European level. So there's a new Europass decision, which is currently being implemented. So there's a couple of changes going on the website and the platform at this very moment. And I'd like to draw your attention to the Europass mobility, which Paul already has mentioned. Because it's very much used in the context of ECVET as a personal transcript for transnational learner mobility. Remember that we have this European template for a memorandum of understanding, and there's this template for the learning agreement, but there's actually no specific ECVET template for the personal transcript. And that's why Europass mobility actually plays quite an important role in the context of ECVET. So, getting back to our core topic of ECVET, so back from the meta level in a way, let's just briefly summarize what we have learned about ECVET so far. You've heard that ECVET can be used alongside other recognition and transparency instruments and initiatives to facilitate the recognition of learning acquired either in non-formal or informal context, fully to the accreditation of prior learning acquired either in formal, non-formal, and informal learning settings, and to facilitate the transfer, recognition, and accumulation of learning outcomes acquired and successfully assessed during a period of transnational mobility. So when a learner goes abroad to do either an internship or a period of learning at a school abroad. So let's take just a quick outlook at the future, at 2020 and beyond. As you might know, at the European level, the Commission is currently preparing the policy framework for the period after the year 2020. So there's a policy framework in place up until 2020, and there are preparations how to move further, how to take things forward. So there might be changes here and there at policy level in the years to come. So this is what we can expect. And this might also be something actually that will come up here and there in discussions at the next week's annual forum in Rotterdam, which you probably will attend. What I just like to point out is that the basic priorities of ECVET will remain the same. So making vocational pathways more flexible, more transparent, making qualifications more easily understood across countries, and making learning more easily transferred across countries and settings. So, since we come a little bit to a close of this webinar, I can imagine that you know that there's so much more information available on ECVET that Paul and I can possibly accommodate in an hour's webinar. So if you would like to learn more about ECVET in the context of transnational mobility, it might really be worth checking out the ECVET Mobility Toolkit. Paul has just mentioned it when we talked about the questions from the chat, where you can really find successful templates on memoranda of understanding, learning outcomes that have been used in previous projects, and lots of other useful advice actually when preparing to send learners abroad. On a more general level, most countries also have ECVET national teams of experts in place who can provide advice and guide you to the information that you need. So it might make sense to check them out to address any questions to them as well. And last but not least, I would like also to point you to the work of the ECVET Secretariat, which operates a website that not only provides you with the latest edition of the ECVET magazine, which can be downloaded freely, and also with all previous editions, but you can also access various documentation and reports on peer learning activities that have been held and organized. Or you can just look for any publications that are related to the topic of ECVET, to the topic of units of learning outcomes or credit transfer. And of course, you are also very welcome to contact the ECVET Secretariat team directly if you're in need of any support or assistance. So with this being said, so far we hope that we have given you a first insight into the topic of ECVET and how you might use it in your country or at your institution, and how you might use it actually to your benefit. Paul, are there any additional questions that we should address right now, or do we have the time to address any additional questions?
Yeah, thanks, Monica. I think, as you say, we've given the basics, what we can do in 60 minutes. I mean, some people must have really sore arms because they've had their hands in the air for 60 minutes as well. So maybe I should have said that you could take that down, but nonetheless, just a couple of quick things before we sign off. We are conscious of busy schedules. This is a basic introduction. Monica has given you some opportunities there for going online to the toolkit. Also, yes, come and find us. The ECVET Secretariat will be well represented at next week's forum in Rotterdam. Both Monica and I will be there as well, and we look forward to seeing some of you in person. There was one last question, and it's actually came very well timed with some of the thoughts I was already having. We had a question earlier, a little bit of lifelong learning for me. I learned out what CCEUs are. It's been addressed in the chat box. But yes, the idea of taking your own qualifications and thinking how ECVET applies to that is very useful. Personalize ECVET, make it work for you. We've talked about, you have to meet the needs of your own awarding authorities, of your own ministries, of your own institution and your own country. So you really do have to personalize it. However, and this comes to another question that just came in about other examples of learning outcomes in a learning context, or examples of how that might be recognized, yes, again, go back to the toolkit, because in the toolkit, you might not have to start at zero. There will be links provided to learning outcome descriptors that have already been written for certain key fields, sectors, qualifications, and these might provide an excellent starting point that you don't have to begin at the very beginning again. There's a database of learning outcomes in the toolkit, so you can really select by different fields and have a look what other people have done. And there are examples as well of assessment tools that have been developed and used with learners and with others. So really, we're pushing you back to the toolkit. We're suggesting that you come and find us. It's all about making ECVET work for you. And in that, I think we're getting very close to the end. So I would like personally to thank you for joining us today and say goodbye. And Monica?
Yes, a very big thank you from myself, of course, as well. It was lovely to have really such a big group in the webinar today. And both Paul and I think we would look forward to meeting you at next week's annual forum in Rotterdam. So we will be both live and would be happy to meet you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.